You're now watching Around the Horne, the weekly internationalist news update with author and historian Gerald Horne.
Today is April 1st, 2026. Welcome everyone to the weekly series entitled Around the Horne, which is an internationalist news update with historian and Professor Gerald Horne. Dr. Horne's latest book, which is available on the International Publisher's website, is entitled The Counter-Revolution of 1893, the Hawaii Coup and the Roots of U.S. Imperialism in the Asia-Pacific Basin. Dr. Horne is also a permanent guest on the radio show, The Horne Report, which airs on Black Power 96 Radio on Sundays at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and Dr. Horne also hosts a radio show entitled Freedom Now, which airs on KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles on Saturdays at 11 a.m. Pacific. And replays of both shows can be found on the Activist News Network. And check out the latest feature of Around the Horne, the Around the Horne Substack, which is a list of some of the articles reviewed by Dr. Horne in preparation of each week's show. Dr. Horne, thank you for coming back on the show, and welcome back to Around the Horne.
Thank you for inviting me.
Horne, as we go around the Horne, we want to continue our discussion of the U.S.-Israeli war on Iran. As the U.S.-Israeli war on Iran has entered its 34th day with no clear end in sight, Iran continues to defend itself against the largest military in the history of mankind. Iran's closing of the Strait of Hormuz has been not only military a quagmire for the U.S., but it has also become a political, economic, and even social crisis that has global impacts. And it should be noted that Iran has allowed its allies ships through the strait, such as China, India, and North Korea. Dr. Horne, the Zugzwang analogy you made last week remains applicable today. But what is your latest assessment and analysis of the U.S.-Israeli war on Iran?
Well, first of all, it's having magnitudinous results and ramifications. Let's just take one country out of many. Speaking of South, because of the energy crisis, that South Koreans should take fewer showers, for example. Now, some of you may be familiar with the boy band group BTS, a knockoff of New Edition, a knockoff of the Five Stair Steps out of Chicago, the Jackson 5. I think that if that edict holds, when you think of BTS in South Korea, you won't think of the funkiness of the music. You'll think of the funkiness that emerges from taking fewer showers. And that's just one result amongst many. Interestingly enough, approximately 36 odd years ago, the United States went to war against Iraq because it was said that in seeking to Kuwait, Iraq would have a stranglehold on world energy supplies. Now, in 2026, the United States has waged war against Iran, with one of the results being, if present conditions hold, that Iran, in controlling the Straits of Hormuz and setting up a toll booth, will have a stranglehold on world energy supplies. Interestingly enough, approximately a year ago, we thought it was April Fool's Day, 2025. It was called Liberation Day when Mr. Trump imposed stiff sanctions against many countries. By the end of 2025, the worm had turned. And as a result of these sanctions, you saw over rare earth minerals, which are necessary for a modern economy. And that was the ultimate result of so-called Liberation Day. That is to say, U.S. imperialism being behind the eight ball. At a certain point, we have to move away from being coincidence theorists and thinking that it's just coincidence that results seem to be perpetually backfiring against U.S. imperialism. Maybe what we're witnessing is an irreversible crisis for U.S. imperialism wherein each maneuver deepens the crisis. For example, on this side of the Atlantic, I'm sure many in our audience are familiar with the skyrocketing price of gasoline at the pump, and we have not hit the ceiling as of yet, which amounts to a wage cut for a good deal of the working class. Once again, we have to consider whether or not this is an unavoidable, inescapable result of a deepening crisis of US imperialism, which does not allow for easy exits. Speaking of easy exits, we will all be tuned in to hear Mr. Trump rather shortly. It's unclear what he'll say because he likes to be unpredictable. And even if he says that he's pulling out within a week or two from Iran, or even if he says that the United States will seek to pull out of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which he's been trashing repeatedly, we should not see that as holy writ. He's capable of reversing himself on a dime and launching a campaign to seize Iranian territory. For example, Harg Island, which he's been talking about seizing since 1988. But having said that, it's unavoidable to mention that there is a crisis in NATO. Spain has forbidden US planes from using its airspace. The neo-fascist ally of the United States and Italy has tried to walk a similar path. Switzerland has tried to walk a similar path. We also see that the defense minister in Germany has said that this is not Germany's war, this is the United States war, which obviously has led Mr. Trump to trash NATO and to speak loosely about pulling out of what he calls this paper tiger. We should not rule out the possibility that Mr. Trump will send these thousands of US military men and women on a kamikaze mission, on a suicide mission to confront a million-strong Iranian military. And we should realize that even if we accept wholly this notion that there are 50,000 US military forces in that part of the planet right now, that hardly holds a candle to 1 million, speaking clearly. We should also realize and should take seriously these very disturbing news reports that suggest that certain members of the Gulf Cooperation Council are encouraging US imperialism to stick it out. They wield significant influence in the United States of America because of their multi-billion-dollar investments. Qatar, for example, you may recall, gifted Mr. Trump a $400 million airplane. We know that the Saudis gave Jared Kushner, the Trump's son-in-law, $2 billion to play with. We know that United Arab Emirates, which we've criticized more than once on this program, supposedly has been egging on Mr. Trump to stick it out. And we also know that the UAE, which is complicit in genocide in the Sudan, also in many ways is close to the Israeli forces. And we know that Israel would like to continue with its pillorying and pillaging of Iran because it would like to see a failed state, just like it tried to turn Syria into a failed state, just like it has tried to turn Lebanon into a failed state. Speaking of the latter, it's quite disturbing to read these press reports in an ironic twist on history that Israeli forces have been going into southern Lebanon and separating the Shia Muslim forces from Christian and Druze forces and ousting altogether the Shia Muslim forces. This has eerie echoes of the 1930s. And I'm afraid to say that a similar process is unfolding in Bahrain, the site of a major US naval base, or has been a site before this bombing of the Iranians, where a corrupt Khalifa family, which has Sunni roots, is being pressed on a regular basis by a substantial Shia population as well, with the latter being targeted like they're being targeted in Lebanon. This is something that should not escape the attention of the international human rights community. And we should also ask ourselves in this context, Will the Gulf Cooperation Council be forced to shed their inhibitions and side openly with Israel, even if the United States chooses to pull out in terms of waging a continuing war against the Iranians? Speaking of Israel, they're not only terrorizing southern Lebanon, they're terrorizing the West Bank as well. And as many commentators have suggested, there is a real question as to whether or not Israel will survive this crisis. And if that turns out to be an accurate prognostication, we need to ask ourselves, what will be the impact on Zionism in the United States? What will be the impact on Jewish nationalism in the United States? Because we know that for those of us who study the history of the US left, Jewish nationalism and Zionism has rarely been absent. Obviously, you just need to look at the record of one Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont, a former Israeli resident, who was slow to call what was happening in Gaza genocide. And like many of that particular ideological sector, has been quick to describe other trends on the US left as being identity politics without looking in the mirror himself. Obviously, if Israel continues to suffer this bombing and this pummeling and this pulverizing that has had to endure since February 28th, it raises searching and profound questions about the tensions that will inevitably be heightened and exacerbated between the pro-Zionist right, which seems to be in the ascendancy. Let me refer you to the polls that suggest that the MAGA base of Mr. Trump is on board, believe it or not, with regard to this catastrophe unfolding in Iran, and that the forces heretofore tied to MAGA, speaking of Tucker Carlson and Megyn Kelly, and Joe Kent recently resigned from the Trump administration, only control or only influence a minority within the MAGA base. That is to say that MAGA is still standing with Mr. Trump, the No Kings movement notwithstanding, and we need to ask ourselves, will this phenomenon that I've just described cause the United States left, such as it is, to adopt a new analysis of the Trump base that will have in the forefront something that a few of us have been underscoring and delineating for a number of years? I'm speaking of class collaboration being an essential element of the settler colonialism that is an adequate descriptor in terms of understanding what's unfolded on these shores since the late 1500s. With regard to Ansar Allah, the so-called Houthis, they've obviously expanded the battlefield by attacking the Israeli port of Eilat, which they had been doing steadily since October 2023. They have to worry right now, it seems to me, whether or not Israel, which established a foothold across the Red Sea in the breakaway province of Somaliland, will be shooting missiles across the Red Sea at Yemen. We need to also ask whether or not Naftali Bennett, who is waiting to replace Benjamin Netanyahu as prime minister, will he carry forth with regard to his stated declaration that when he assumes power, that Turkey will be next on the hit list, despite the fact that Turkey is a member of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, has U.S. bases on its soil, and has a population about 9 or 10 times the size of Israel, for example. We've already mentioned the United Arab Emirates and their various forms of deviltry, and we have to ask ourselves if the UAE will be so weakened that it will be forced to curtail its deviltry in Sudan, where it has been a major sponsor of the depredations that have been unfolding in that particular African nation. At the end of the day, the question that should be animating much of our thinking is whether or not 2026 is the equivalent of 1956, as we mentioned on previous programs, where Britain and France, once again allied with Israel, had to retreat from its attack on Nasser's Egypt over the Suez Canal, not only because of objections of the Soviet Union, but also, at the end of the day, objections of President Eisenhower. Is this the equivalent of 1989, which saw the retreat of socialist forces, starting with formerly socialist East Germany? That is to say, are we witnessing the unraveling of the hegemony of US imperialism? I think that we'll get a glimpse of whether or not that's the case when we, or at least some of us, tune in to Mr. Trump's remarks after I finish speaking. And no, he did not consult with this particular program when he decided to schedule his remarks concerning what will be the outcome of this tragic US intervention in Iran.
Horne, as we go around the horn, we also want to continue our weekly discussion regarding the U.S. war on Cuba. The U.S. continues its intensification of the six-decade U.S. policy, which seeks to suffocate and strangle Cuba's economy to force regime change. Cuba is experiencing the most severe fuel shortage imaginable, a crisis that is paralyzing its economy and inflicting even greater and more profound suffering on its 11 million people than is imaginable. This is a direct, calculated result of the United States government's actions. On the other side of the ledger, on March 30th, a Russian oil tanker carrying 100,000 barrels of oil reached Cuba, and apparently, Mexico is also planning to resume sending oil to Cuba. Dr. Horne, many of our friends on the left have been quite critical of Russia since February 2022, if not much longer. But what is your reaction to Russia breaking the U.S. oil blockade against Cuba? What is the significance of this oil delivery, particularly in relation to what is going on globally? And how should we be viewing Russia at this critical juncture in history?
Well, obviously, what Russia is doing with regard to Cuba is significant and profound. Russia stands to be a beneficiary of the current conjuncture insofar as it has oil, and with Mr. Trump doing his damnedest to send the price of a barrel of oil northward up to about $200, which will have magnitudinous impact at the gasoline pump from Los Angeles through Honolulu to New York City. Russia will stand to benefit and therefore can extend maximum aid to socialist Cuba. We should also mention the tons of rice that have been shipped to Cuba from Vietnam, with regard to Vietnam repaying Cuba for its solidarity during the tragic US intervention in that Southeast Asian nation from approximately 1965 to 1975. We should also mention the reported 30,000 tons of rice from the People's Republic of China sent to the Isle of Freedom, speaking of Cuba. But having said that, Cuba is not out of the woods as of yet, despite the fact that there was also a significant donation and contribution of tons of aid from our comrades here in the United States of America, not to mention our comrades south of the border in Mexico. In other words, if, as suspected, Mr. Trump decides to withdraw to a degree from this fiasco in Iran, reportedly he's bored with what he has unraveled there, it will give him more time and opportunity to turn his attention to socialist Cuba. And therefore, we need to be on our guard. Therefore, we need to be gearing up to take militant action to restrain the warmongers in Washington, D.C.
Horne, as we go around the horn, we also want to ask you about the news from March 25th, that the UN General Assembly passed a historic resolution, spearheaded by Ghana, declaring the transatlantic slave trade, quote, the gravest crime against humanity, and calling for reparations. The resolution, supported by 123 countries, urges global action for restitution, apology, and compensation for the enduring legacy of slavery. Of course, the U.S., Israel, and Argentina voted against the resolution. But Dr. Horne, what is your reaction to this news? How significant of a victory is this? And does this resolution provide new leverage for reparations movement?
It is profound and significant. And in order to make sure it becomes ever more significant, I would urge and encourage our comrades and friends in New York City to picket the United Nations missions of the United States of America, of Israel, and Argentina in particular. Speaking of Israel, it's quite curious, is it not, that the state of Israel received reparations from the Federal Republic of Germany, despite the fact that Israel was not in existence at the time of the Holocaust, concluding in 1945, with Israel coming into existence circa 1947, 1948. It's also curious, is it not, that Argentina, the Argentine, decided to vote against this resolution, though it was able to profit from the African slave trade. Indeed, as some of us have written, the national dance of Argentina comes from forms of the tango that were developed by enslaved Africans in the late 18th century and the early 19th century. And in fact, the kind of white supremacy that tends to whitewash that history of Africans in Argentina is of a piece with the kind of whitewashing you see in the history of the United States of America. And indeed, you can see some of the interviews we've done on this subject that should be found on the Activist News Network. That is to say, shows from KPFK Los Angeles, the Freedom Now program, with scholars who specialize in Black Argentine history. We should also ask ourselves why and how it is that nations like Poland and Bulgaria abstained with regard to this very profoundly important vote. Some of us are old enough to remember the bygone days of socialist Poland and socialist Bulgaria, who those regimes would not have abstained. And once again, as I've mentioned more than once, we need to ask some of our elders who are still with us, perhaps having as much gray hair as myself, where were they when there was a socialist Poland and a socialist Bulgaria? Did they turn their backs on those particular regimes and therefore pave the way for this shameful and shameless abstention by Poland and Bulgaria, amongst other formerly socialist regimes in Eastern Europe? And I should also give a shout out to President Mahama of Ghana, who's obviously walking in the footsteps not only of founding father Kwame Nkrumah, but also of the Black American expatriate community, those like W.E.B. Du Bois, who perished there in late August 1963, those like his then spouse, Shirley Graham Du Bois, who accompanied him to West Africa. In fact, there was a sizable Black American so-called colony in Accra, Ghana, up until the overthrow of Mr. Nkrumah some decades ago. And I would be remiss if I failed to mention the regime of Jerry Rawlings, who arises some decades ago and tried to carry on the banner of anti-imperialism spearheaded by Kwame Nkrumah. But in any case, this historic vote at the United Nations is going to put more wind in the sails of the struggle for reparations. And in that regard, in addition to picketing the United Nations missions of Israel, of the United States, of Argentina, perhaps of Poland and Bulgaria as well, we should also consider what we should do in terms of sending delegations to Cuba, to Iran, perhaps after the bombs stop falling, to Russia, to China, to South Africa, to Zimbabwe, because I think that some of us can now see that the question of reparations to the descendants of enslaved Africans has climbed a notch on the agenda and will continue to climb as long as we have our shoulder at the wheel.
Horne, as we go around the horn, we also want to ask you about South Africa. On March 29th, it was reported that, caving to pressure from the U.S., France has rescinded its invitation to South Africa for the Group of Seven, G7, summit to be held in the French town of Evian in June. On the other side of the ledger, it was reported on March 25th that the Chinese Vice President Han Zheng met with South African President Cyril Ramaphosa in Cape Town, with both sides pledging to deepen bilateral cooperation and relations. Dr. Horne, what is your reaction and analysis of these two developments related to South Africa?
Well, obviously, South Africa is in the crosshairs, which many in our audience might find surprising, because many, perhaps understandably, have been quite critical of the African National Congress government. But what needs to be realized is that there is a certain kind of settler solidarity that extends across the Atlantic that helps to explain why Mr. Trump extended an invitation to South African settlers, predominantly Afrikaners, that is to say, the descendants of the original Dutch and French Protestant settlers going back to the 17th century, to come settle in the United States at our expense. A settler solidarity is one of the phenomena that we need more exploration of, along with white supremacy, along with class collaboration. I think that when we begin to do that exploration, we will find that settler solidarity is one of the sturdiest oaks in the pro-imperialist forest. We should also not forget that just before February 28th, 2026, and this inglorious bombing of Iran, you have military maneuvers off the coast of Cape Town, off the coast of the southern tip of Africa, involving South Africa, involving China and Russia in terms of the BRICS nations, and also involving Iran, interestingly enough. And that kind of military maneuver has not been forgotten by US imperialism, just as their comrades in Israel have yet to forgive South Africa for bringing that profoundly important case before the International Court of Justice in The Hague, charging that South Africa is prosecuting Israel for its depredations against the Palestinian population, which is unfolding as we speak in our litany with regard to South Africa's depredations in Lebanon. We should have mentioned, Israel's depredations in Lebanon. We should have mentioned in that context Israel's depredations and terrorism on the West Bank as well. So, like it or not, we have to recognize that South Africa is desperately in need of our solidarity. And in that regard, as we mentioned a week or so ago, I was happy of the formerly apartheid state saw fit to visit Chicago for the funeral of Reverend Jesse Jackson. I was hoping, and I continue to hope, that that will reignite the solidarity movement pre-1994, which was so powerful in passing sanctions
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.
Power to the people.